So we're not having a fireside chat, even though our agenda says there's no fire. But we are going to have a chat, and it's going to be super fun to have a conversation with Dr. Sanjay Gupta. And I think you're going to come up on the screen here any moment, because we have 60 minutes to have this conversation.
Is that too big? That might be too big.
So I'm going to set the scene for you, Sanjay, so you get a feel for the room. We have a lovely auditorium. Outside, we're surrounded by trees in the Center for Brain Health in Dallas. And in case you might miss it, Sandy Chapman and her team have this enormous sign that says Brain Health emblazoned across the top of the building. And although we've been talking about brain health for a long time, I don't think I've been any place that has it so visibly at the top of their agenda. And so we're here to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Center for Brain Health and the team's amazing work in this space. And so I know that Dr. Gupta, you have joined the Center for Brain Health before, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here back again.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is one of those things that really speaks to me. When I first heard about the Center for Brain Health, I jumped at the opportunity to be a part of that. I think, as was just mentioned, we don't talk about brain health enough. You do, and I do, and it's a great pleasure to be with you as well, Sarah. I mean, I applaud all the work that AARP is doing, and I've always enjoyed our conversations. We get right to it, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, and so we have a room full of proselytizers for brain health here. There are a lot of neuroscientists and advocates, but I don't think there's another neurosurgeon. So, there's somebody waving their hand who is a neurosurgeon. Good. Well,
how do we know each other? Not that many of us.
So just by way of background, Dr. Gupta, tell us a little bit. You've spent your life really thinking about brain and brain health. So how did you get started down this path?
Well, for me, it was pretty personal, I think, as is the case for a lot of people who pursue this career. I didn't have anybody in my family who was a doctor, certainly nobody in the world of neurosurgery. But I had a grandfather, my mom's father, who had developed a stroke when I was around 12 or 13 years old. And, very close to my grandfather. I saw what had happened to him, what had happened to his brain. And I spent a lot of time with him in the hospital. And I think it was the first time I got a sense that I could be a doctor, maybe. That was a profession that I could potentially pursue. But also this fascination with the brain. It just, it was endlessly fascinating then, 38 years ago. And it's still that way for me. I'll tell you, like a specific thing, he had the ability to write, but could not read. He had the ability to speak, but he could not understand. In fact, he could write something and then not read what he had just written. I give that by way of example to say, the brain is so mysterious. I mean, it's 3.5 pounds of the most enigmatic tissue in the known universe. It contains all of our dreams and our thoughts and our joys and our loves and everything. And that's what really got me interested in it. Now, I will say that for much of my career as a neurosurgeon, we're talking about the medicalization of the brain. That's what I learned. How to address problems such as tumors and blood collections on top of the brain, things like that. I think it was really over the last 20 years now, especially as a journalist, where I started to do these deeper investigations and to sort of look at the brain in a different way, not just treatment of disease, but optimization of brain. And I sort of got to the point now where I think we are thinking of the brain the same way we thought about the heart a quarter century ago. We thought it was just, you got what you got, that was it, nothing to be done. That's how we thought about the heart. That is how we've thought about the brain, and neither one of those things are true. And I think that's really inspiring that we can actually improve our brain function throughout our lives.
You know, it's so interesting. Admiral McRaven was talking about his personal journey yesterday evening, and it was his father and his heart attack, and the fact that medical science really wasn't quite up to speed when it came to appropriate treatment for the heart and his father's heart attack. But it was a visionary healthcare Air Force doctor who kind of was bucking the tradition to talk about how one should be exercising to improve from coronary heart disease and stroke. So I'm really interested in this idea of we've come so far. The center is 25 years old, but it wasn't too long ago when most people in the scientific profession, including the ones who are supposed to know, really were thinking that the brain was not changeable. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of that change in medicine?
For sure. And I think you're absolutely right. And I don't know who the neurosurgeon is in the crowd, but we are probably trained in the same way, would be my guess. So I think the idea of treatment of a brain problem, diagnosing the problem, and then treatment of the problem, that was where, and really, frankly, is still where most of the attention is placed. Understandably, people come in with a particular problem, and you diagnose that problem, and then it's treated. We have, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, we have evolved to start thinking about prevention more, even when it comes to brain disease. We've thought about prevention with lots of other diseases for longer. But again, I think the brain has always been a bit mystical for people, perhaps because it's encased in skull, and we think it's a black box. A black box is something that can be measured by its inputs and its outputs, but you can't really see the machinations of how it works. But as we've started to be able to see the brain, not only in a pathological state, a disease state or an injured state, but in a healthy state as well, I think we've started to understand the brain more in terms of what could prevent certain problems, but also the idea of optimization, which I think is the further evolution of that. It's not just that I want to prevent disease. I want to make sure my, in this case, brain is functioning as well as it possibly can. How do I optimize that sort of function? So I think that has sort of been the standard evolution. That's been the evolution, I think, in medicine all along. But the brain is sort of the last one to the table, I think, in part because it's been treated with reverence, but also with this mysticism, I think, to some extent. I will say that the imaging of brains has really accelerated over the last decade or so. I was sort of likening it to this documentary series called Earth at Night. I don't know if you ever saw this, but basically these photographers with these very low ambient light cameras went out and started imaging the Earth at night, wildlife and everything else. And we saw something we never had really seen before. When at night, we didn't know how many of these animals were actually behaving. Wild predators who were actually very loving with their cubs, things like that. We had never seen it before. So we made all these assumptions about what the Earth was like at night. And I think it's the same thing with the brain. The brain at night was something that we had really never seen. And I would say that was the healthy brain. We only got to look at the brain when there was a problem. But the question was, what is happening when there's not a problem? Is it actually continuing to grow, continuing to spawn new cells? And the answer is yes. We do continue to grow new brain cells at any age. And I think that was a pretty revelatory thing. I remember when neuroscientists first started talking about it at these meetings I would attend a decade ago. It was sort of the fringe meeting, at the end of the session. And now it's sort of front and center. I think the idea that we can grow new brain cells at any age. And by the way, here's how you can continue to do that.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about at any age. We haven't thus far in this meeting been talking too much about longevity. Of course, at AARP, we're most interested in people 50 and older and their families, but we are talking about it as a lifespan approach, because your brain doesn't just start at age 50, right? It's a developmental process. But when AARP and you came to AARP and started talking about the book that was Keep Sharp, How to Build a Better Brain at Any Age, I think that was really, revolutionary in the sense of, we know that people today believe that cognitive decline is inevitable. That's not only is medical science taking a while to understand what's really happening, but the public at large. And I want to talk to you about moving the public at large along this continuum of understanding of the brain health, and maybe what your book helped people think about.
I'll preface by saying, I just returned from Tokyo last night. And part of the reason I was there was working on projects around longevity. And, I think as an investigative journalist who's also a neuro person, I have this sort of very interesting lens into things, because you see what is happening in our country and in the developed world overall. We see the rates of dementia increasing, and people understandably very worried about their brain health. And again, that's understandable. You do find these communities around the world where dementia is much, much more rare, and even to the point where it's reportable in some communities, meaning that if you see a case of Alzheimer's dementia, you would report it. That's not the case here because we've become so used to it. But I think that's not to admonish the developed world as much as to say, hey, look, what's going on here? We're all humans. Why are there some places where this just does not occur as much as it does here? And are there lessons that we can learn from those places and then apply them here? That's what sort of got me started on that journey overall, and writing the book. And then started just attending neuroscience meetings, really just doing the work, spending time with neuroscientists, doing almost 2 years worth of interviews with neuroscientists, and saying, what do we know now that we didn't know then? And I think that was, again, the biggest thing was this idea that there is a sort of use it or lose it phenomenon with the brain, just like with other parts of the body. In the developed world, we get to sort of early mid 60s, and our engagement cognitively starts to decline. If you retire from work, you're probably not as engaged, obviously, from your professional life. If you don't have close family connections, you may start to feel discarded from your personal life as well. You're just not using your brain as much. Not everybody, but a significant percentage of people. And I think overall, that is part of what is, I think, driving our belief, and to some extent false belief, that there is a significant cognitive decline at a certain age. Is there some? Yes. Do we have wear and tear with the brain like we do other places? Yes. But not, I think, nearly to the degree that people believe. I was in Okinawa, and I was spending time with somebody he's a karate master who still does 5-digit math in his head. He's 90 years old. And I don't say that to say, hey, look, here's the remarkable tale of an individual in Okinawa who does that. It's more to tell those stories in our documentaries about what is possible. Mm-hmm. He's not taking a new medication. He's not undergoing some remarkable procedure. He's just a guy who uses his brain. He's super connected with everybody, focuses on building resilience, both physically and mentally, on a daily basis. And at 90 years old, still does things that people who are 40 years old oftentimes don't dream of being able to do. So that's really, I think, what sort of propelled the idea of the book. I would, and you and I talked about this, Sarah, but when I first did this, I would just start telling my own parents and their friends about these things. And then I thought, well, maybe there's something to share more broadly, and I wanted to make it understandable so that people, really understood the brain science, but then applicable. So now that I know this, what do I do with this? Mm-hmm. That was the real goal.
So one of the things, how's the jet lag? How are you doing individually?
I appreciate you asking. I'm doing okay. I guess it was Taylor Swift the other day that said jet lag is a choice. I'm not sure I totally buy that, but I'm doing okay. It's midnight now, 12:15 in the morning for me.
Well, one of the so one of the analogies you used is, your father was involved in the car business, and you
Mm,
were using the analogy of maintaining your brain like you might maintain your car. You want
yeah.
to expand a little bit about it, and then, if you can, what are you doing for yourself besides suffering through jet lag, to help yourself maintain your own brain?
Yeah, it's really interesting. My parents are both automotive engineers. They were, and and like I said, I'm the only person who went into medicine in my family. So every time I would come home from medical school or whatever and talk about what I'd learned, they'd say, "Oh, well, that's just like the car. You got to add more oil over here. You got to make sure the brakes are running well. You got to make sure you can accelerate and decelerate quickly, that you're not overheating the car." And it was just funny how they would sort of mechanize the body. And that's not that hard, son. Just do this. And but then we always got into this notion of consciousness. And I said, okay, with all the explanations and all the analogies you can make to a car, where does consciousness lie in the car? And that always brought the conversation to a different level, I think. But I think there was a lot of similarities, though. We do think of our brains, I think, again, with a bit of this understandable mysticism, but the idea that it can accelerate and decelerate quickly, that you understand how to cool it down so it's not constantly running hot, that it's comfortable, that it feels resilient, that if you get in some sort of crash, you're going to be well protected. I think all of those analogies still lie true. We don't know where consciousness lies, either in the brain or in the car, but I think that the those analogies were pretty good for me, and I think it did sort of shape how I think about my own brain in the book, and I think in life overall. I'll give you an example. I think the conventional wisdom, in part because of Framingham studies and how we thought about heart disease, over the last several decades, was what is good for the heart is good for the brain. And I think, as a general rule, that is true. I mean, they are both highly vascular organs, so understanding how to maintain vascular health um, will apply to both. But there are these differences as well. So um, I've always been a pretty intense exerciser, for example. I run races, I do triathlons, things like that. And what I sort of learned, and I learned this from a prominent neuroscientist, someone who was actually the professor that we all studied when I was in med school. People may know Eric Kandel, but he's a remarkable guy. He talked about this idea that we create brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and this may have come up at your earlier sessions, BDNF. And BDNF is sort of, as they say, the sort of miracle grow for the brain. If we can grow new brain cells at any age, what enables you to do that? The more BDNF you have, or the more constant production of it, the better. And one of the best ways to do that is through movement. We know that we tend to make more BDNF when we're in motion. It's almost like the body is saying, hey, as long as you're in motion, we get that you still want to be here. We get that you still want to have an active and smart brain. So we'll make plenty of this BDNF. But here was a little bit of the problem. Here's the nuance, which I thought was important. With intense exercise, you make plenty of BDNF, but you also made a lot of cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and there's evidence that cortisol will actually suppress BDNF. So intense exercise may be very good for the heart, but moderate exercise, moderate activity is probably better for the brain. So in addition to I'll try and do something intense still. I worry about heart disease, but I'll still go for a brisk walk with my wife and the dogs as well. Not something that I would prioritize before. I just thought of that as a luxury. Hey, we got a little time. Let's go for a walk. Now I'm thinking about what it does for my brain. I'll just give you, I mean, I have so many thoughts on this, but I'll give you another example that's a little bit different for the brain versus the heart. When we consume a lot of energy, in the form of sugar, for example. Our bodies, I think, as most people know, would love to store that energy. We like energy because we run in this sort of feast or famine sort of situation. We don't know if we're going to be fed again. So let's store as much as possible. When you look at the brain, it doesn't tend to respond the same way. It's a very narrow window of sort of energy absorption. So if the sugar levels, for example, get too high, you will start to shut down receptors in the brain. So it actually doesn't take in more and more energy. It actually shuts down, which is why you could be stuffing the body and starving the brain at the same time. I have three kids, three teenagers. I think it's in part why they would crash so hard if they ate sugar. They actually were starving their brain by consuming that much energy. So here's an example where the body and the brain are different again. And I think, you can start to really extend these metaphors. What is happening during sleep to your brain? What is happening during stress to your brain? When you start to understand those things, I think it fundamentally changes how you react, how you take care of your brain. I meditate every day now. What I've realized, Sarah, is that people say, I want to live a life without stress. That's not a good idea. You need stress. It gets you out of bed in the morning. It helps you overcome jet lag, study for an exam, whatever it may be.
Deal with
Well,
AT&T outages with your cell
no,
phone.
I know exactly. I didn't know if this would even work today, but here we are talking, so that's good. The idea that it's not the stress, it's the relentless nature of the stress that is the problem. We need to cool the car, just like my dad said. We can run it hot, but it's got to be cooled down afterward. And so for me, the meditation, walks in nature, things that I previously saw as a luxury, now when I'm doing it, breathing in all those phytoncides, these stress busting chemicals in nature, that aroma of the forest, that is something that's actually good for my brain. And it helps bust or at least relieve that stress for periods of time so that I can run the car hot again if I need to. And so I saw those things as a luxury before. Now I see them as a necessity. And I imagine when I'm doing them, how good it is for my brain. But those are some of the things that I do.
So, when you were in Japan, I've been hearing about this concept of Shinrin-yuki or forest bathing.
Shinrin-yoku. Yes.
Did you experience any of that where you're out while you were there and on a previous
Yeah.
trip?
Yes, no, I did. In fact, I spent a fair amount of time with people who I think have really pioneered this concept in Japan. And it's exactly what we're talking about. It is this idea of forest bathing. That's what the term means in English. Shunrin-yoku is the term in Japanese. And it's not getting wet, forest bathing. It's rather immersing yourself in the forest. And it's really fascinating, Sarah, because I think as a society, especially as scientists, we kind of know things anecdotally. I mean, no one's going to be surprised that being outside in nature is good for you. No one is surprised by that. But I think the question is, A, can you prove it? And B, how good is it for you? And I think that's where they've been going in Japan with Shinrin-yoku, is that they've been conducting these large trials. So when I went, they did a bunch of parameters, including blood pressure, but also a saliva cortisol test, things like that, before I went out and did the forest bathing. And then we were outside and really understanding what it meant. I just mentioned this term phytoncides. It turns out plants give off these chemicals that to communicate to other plants, and we find that phytoncides are these stress busting chemicals. It helps other plants relieve their stress, and you'll see this from mama plants doing this to baby plants and things like that, all of a sudden releasing a bunch of phytoncides. What I think has been sort of interesting over the last decade or so, and I think what spawned Shinrin-yoku, is the idea that we humans also have receptors for phytoncides. Why do we have receptors for phytoncides? Um, well, it turns out that we can benefit from breathing in those phytoncides, similar to how plants do it themselves. And so here's a mechanism for how this might work, why being outside is good for you. They were measuring it. My cortisol levels came down. That was not surprising to me. My heart rate and blood pressure came down, but they were measuring it. They were showing that it worked across populations. They were enrolling men and women, old and young, different ethnicities. They wanted to make sure this was something that actually applied to humans, to humanity, not just to a certain demographic. And now they have some 10 years worth of data. So, uh, when I breathe in again the aroma of the forest, and you can all imagine what that smells like. It is doing something for you. It is doing something to your brains, and it has helped relieving stress in a way that is very predictable and measurable now.
So, not everybody lives right next to a forest,
Right.
but right here in Dallas, when you pull into the parking lot, there are trees surrounding this space, and immediately the temperature goes down, the calmness goes up a little bit. And so we've been talking a little bit about design, deliberate design, so that we can foster better brain health here. And I know we haven't really talked about this in our preamble, but thinking about how society can move from this place where we're injuring our brains. And I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about that because I know you've been talking about distractions and those kinds of things through, this wonderful device here. But what are your ideas or thoughts about deliberately creating spaces in which, even though you may not be in the middle of the forest or you may not be in a meditation center, we as society can kind of move towards a space where we're creating opportunities for better brain health?
Yeah, this is a topic that comes up a lot, and it's come up in our own company at Warner Brothers. When we think about design of the future, there's been a lot of focus on air quality and things like that, which is really important. But I think what is interesting is this idea that sometimes we tend to think of things as binary, like we need to create an entire environment that fosters a particular thing, in this case, brain health. And again, I think what whenever I've been asked about it, and I'm not sure people listen to me necessarily, but if they do,
Maybe
what I've
once,
sort of
twice,
focused
a
on is
few
this
people.
idea, yeah, this idea that it's the breaks. It's finding places that you can actually go and get a break from the stress or the break from the incessant nature of the stress, at least. So everyone's heard the term blue zones, but the idea that you're talking about these trees as you come into a space to have these green zones, but we find that even looking at nature can be helpful. You're not necessarily going to get the phytoncides, but you're getting a lot of the benefits of being out in nature just by looking at nature. Being within a certain distance from nature can be really helpful. But finding places within an environment where you can get a break from the stress, I think becomes really important. It's not to say that in your office space or other spaces that you want to be, working hard and really being able to get your work done. But are there places where you can go to sort of decompress for a while, to let the engine cool? I think that becomes really important. And there was a study, and it was in this book, the same Shinrin-yoku book, talking about what distance, if you look at homes, you look at offices, what distance from green spaces, green zones, end up making a difference. And I think they found that within a few hundred meters, if there was trees and areas that you could go or at least see, that ended up making a difference in terms of overall design for relieving stress. Not completely removing it, but at least relieving it for periods of time.
So let's talk about external and internal factors that can harm our brains, from distractions and depression and in between. So let's talk about youth in particular and the distractions that young people are facing. Can you share with us your thinking about that?
Yeah, and look, I've been talking as a doctor, and this someone who wrote this book, but I'll talk. I think about this a lot as a dad. As you know, Sarah, I have three teenage girls, and that is my
God
primary
bless you.
job. It's the best thing in the world. It really is. I mean, they're incredibly delightful, and I think I have great I'm inspired by them on a regular basis, you know, and I know that they're going to inhabit the world long after we're all gone. Um, I think that the world in which they live now is a highly distractible world. I don't you know, I think a lot about social media, and I try and have a open sort of eye to it, an open mind to it. I think there can be some benefits to the connectedness that comes from social media. I was raising these girls, and they went through a pandemic where it was very hard for them all of a sudden to engage with other people at a very formative time in their lives. And I do think, for to some extent, social media was helpful to them during those times, because the isolation and the loneliness, even without a pandemic, is a significant problem in our society, and maybe more significant for older generations and even for them. But I think the distractedness that comes with this, the ability to not focus and to not experience the joy of really being able to hold your attention on one thing for a period of time, is one of the more problematic things for young people, and it's something that we think about a lot. There's other, I think, larger issues for older populations, but that distractibility, I think that I do worry about it. I worry about that more than the content itself. Sometimes the content can be moderated, and I think social media companies need to do a better job of that. But for their own brains, just being able to have that focus, I think, is something that they're losing a lot. The length of the books they'll read. My kids do not watch anything on television anymore because they want everything presented to them in, you know, 1 minute or so snippets. You know, it's these little tiny videos. And I don't know, and to be honest, I don't think anybody knows for sure where that goes long term. What does that mean in 20, 30 years? We, my generation, I'm in my mid 50s now, we read shorter books. We watch shorter movies. We don't hold our attention as long as an older generation. And I think that that's going to even be exacerbated with these younger generations. But I don't know what that means. I don't. I think it's easy to be gloom and doom about it, but I'm not a gloom and doom person. I think that we will probably adapt, but I do think that it's not good for their brains to have that distractibility.
The constant distractions. So we've been talking a little bit about AI and whether that will
Mm.
help humans. And I think maybe it was Ariane Huffington yesterday that was talking about perhaps we can use AI to help us as humans, not necessarily take all our jobs, but help in some way of encouraging the best part of humans. What do you think about perhaps AI and the brain health space? What are you either worried about or what are you intrigued about when it comes to AI?
Yeah, this is a big topic. I hope Sandy will have me back next year so we can spend an entire session on this, because I think it is that important. I sit on the subcommittee for AI for the National Academy of Medicine, and so this is something that we think about a lot. Um, you know, my general approach when people ask about you know, the hope versus the hype, uh, is that, look, it is here. So I think that we just need to concede certain things without saying, hey, look, I think it's overblown, whatever. All that may be true, but it's also here, and it's happening really quickly. And there is a lot of hope. I mean, I have friends of mine who are scientists who spend their lives trying to replicate the structures of certain proteins. And it can take them years to do this sort of work. And there have been instances now where AI could do this work in hours. It can do in hours what it's taken human scientists years to do. I think when it comes to medical practice, I'm a practicing neurosurgeon. Every film in my hospital at Emory Clinic, whether it's a chest X-ray or an MRI of the brain, is read by an AI platform first. So, you know, I think the efficiencies with regard to things like that, the efficiencies with insurance approvals and all the back office sort of management, a lot of that's happening already, and it's kind of frictionless, meaning that you're not even being told, hey, an AI platform scheduled that for you. It's just sort of happening in the background already. And that's the way it should be. It should be frictionless, I think, in this regard. But I think the biggest thing to keep in mind, and I've constantly been reminded of this by my peers at the academy as well, is that AI is not a computer. And that may sound like a simple thing to say, but it means a lot. AI is not a computer. If you go look up something on your computer, like when was the War of 1812? You probably don't go then to another computer and ask the same question to see if the first computer got it right. AI is designed to replicate human consciousness. It's not designed to be a supercomputer. So, for example, if I asked you, what's the book Charlotte's Web? Tell me about that, the characters in Charlotte's Web. You as a human would probably say, oh yeah, there's, Wilbur the pig, there's Charlotte, obviously, there's a little girl. And then if I said, what's the book about? You as a human would give me your sort of answer to that. A computer would give an answer to that as well. Here's what the book is about. But then if I asked you, give me the first chapter of Charlotte's Web, a computer could do that. You couldn't. I couldn't as humans. An AI platform cannot do that either, but it will try. It will try to do that. And all of a sudden, it'll spit out a first chapter of Charlotte's Web that will be very informed by everything that's going on in the world at that point, by all the inputs that it's taking in. Oh, well, the girl was not a nice person. She was not protecting human life over the life of a pig, and she was an evil person, whatever it might be. But here's the problem. If you think AI is a computer, then that first chapter you just got from the AI platform becomes the truth. And that truth is not the truth, but it becomes a truth. And that gets propagated. So all of a sudden, what we think was the first chapter, I'm using that just as an example, the first chapter of Charlotte's Web becomes the new truth of what Charlotte's Web is. Now, not a huge problem when it comes to an old book, but maybe a much bigger problem when it comes to your healthcare. If you have a platform that starts to fill in the gaps, because like a human wants to fill in gaps without really necessarily knowing, that can become a problem when it comes to healthcare. So how much do we allow an AI platform to control healthcare? And I think where we're starting to land, and it'll evolve, but where we're starting to land is the old sort of trust but verify model. Yes, we'll let AI look at images from the hospital, but then they have to be verified by a radiologist, by a human being. And it's not that human beings can't make mistakes, but AI is fallible. When you look at your computer technology, you do not think of computers as fallible. You think of them as infallible, giving you the right answer every time you ask for it. AI is not going to do that. So it can be a huge tool, a huge adjunct. It can be very helpful, I think. My kids are using it quite regularly now. I think they'd be at a disadvantage if they didn't know how to use it already in their schoolwork and other things. But I think we have to be really open-eyed about what it is, a very helpful tool, and what it isn't. It's not a supercomputer. So I think that's going to help direct how we think and how we use AI going into the future, at least the immediate future.
Mm-hmm. So you have a room full of people who understand the power and importance of brain health and have different visions. We've covered everything from technology to societal interventions where the justice system creates challenges and barriers to people for maintaining brain health. We've really run the gamut. But in the audience, we have this sense of possibility and this idea that we might create a movement towards a change in health in a transformative way. And after all, the title of this talk is a health revolution. So if you had the ability to gather us all together and point us in a direction for a health revolution, what would you say? Oh, you do have that opportunity, and it's now. So what should we be doing?
Yeah. Well, look, I think what I've learned over, more than 20 years now as an investigative journalist and, 30 years practicing medicine, um, we'd like to have a platform of truth, platform to begin with, when it comes to creating evidence and then creating, potential interventions or solutions or ideas to, in this case, optimize brain health. So there may be many things that we kind of generally know to be true, things that we should be doing to try and prevent, but also optimize our brain health. But I think there is some virtue in being able to create measurables. And that is what attracted me to the Center for Brain Health in the first place. When I was doing all this work, of course, I came across the work of the Center for Brain Health, and I thought I asked the same question I think Sandy and everyone else there has probably asked for a long time. What is brain health? What is good brain health? How do you measure that? And then how do you collect that data and show that certain things that you do for your brain actually improve your brain health? So we're not sort of guessing or sharing just anecdotal stories. Again, it's the same sort of thinking that I think was going on with heart health, several decades ago. Now it's sort of accepted that you should lower your blood pressure, that too high cholesterol is not a good thing, that here's a better diet for that, and all sorts of things. Um, how do we get to that level of brain health, measurements of brain health with the brain, which is understandably and arguably much harder to measure? What is the role of resilience when it comes to brain health? Is that a marker of good brain health? Clarity. These are things from the Center for Brain Health's website. Connectedness. What does that mean to have actual connections? Is that measurable? I find that fascinating. I'll just expound on that for a second. When I was writing about the idea of isolation and loneliness being bad for the brain, again, that shouldn't surprise anybody. We need to be having connections with people. And even when I wrote that it's not the quantity of these connections, but the quality, also not surprising. But what does that mean to have a high quality connection? How do you measure that? Is it someone you can call if you have a problem? Okay, yeah, but that's sort of medicalizing it again, not necessarily exactly what we're sort of trying to get at here. When I interviewed a lot of loneliness researchers about the specific idea of the connection between isolation and loneliness and brain health, I think what I heard was a very interesting supposition, which was that um, I was talking about my own parents, for example, and I'm very close to my parents. They're older. They live in a different state. Uh, I would call them and say, "How you doing?" "I'm doing fine." "How you doing?" "I'm doing fine." And we talk a lot, but the conversations were sort of superficial. And this loneliness researcher said to me, the next time you talk to them, ask for help in some small way. Just ask for help. And as I mentioned, my parents are both automotive engineers, and my wife had come home and her car had some smoke coming out from underneath the hood. So I said, "Oh, Mom and Dad, while I got you, the cars had some smoke and this, that, and the other thing." Right away, they put on the reading glasses, turn on your FaceTime, open the hood, and I'm showing them this and all that. The point wasn't that the car had smoke coming from the hood. It was all of a sudden this different interaction that we were having. And more importantly, it did two things. It allowed me to be vulnerable around my parents and allowed me to give purpose to my parents. My parents had this now purpose that was driving it. And it led to all these other conversations that had nothing to do with the car. But that was for her, this loneliness researcher, an example of how you hack your way, for example, to a more profound relationship, a more quality relationship. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think understanding what the factors are for the optimization of brain health, being able to really define those, being able to measure those for people, such as I think the Center for Brain Health does, and other people talk about this a lot, but the idea of what is the value of clarity? What is the value of connectedness? What is the value of emotional balance slash resilience? And then following those things over time with interventions. Hey, when you sleep, you're consolidating long memories, you're clearing away waste, and look what that's done for the clarity of your thinking. I find all of that really, really fascinating. And I do believe that, as with Framingham for heart disease, as with the Happiness Project, at Harvard. I think that we could be in that same position within the next several years when it comes to brain health. That it's not just going to feel like anecdotal, like, yeah, I know I should do good things for my brain, but actually really, really prescriptive in a way that is accessible for people. That this is what I do for good brain health, and it becomes a way of life for people. That's a dream, but it's a really, really good dream.
And attainable, I would say. And we're
Attainable.
just the
Yeah.
group to do it. I know that there are questions in the audience, and we have 15 minutes for Q&A. And I think, Steve, you're going to help manage some of the...
Unlike what we did with Ariana, we're going to ask you to take your questions. Do we have mic runners to go ahead? Let's go ahead and get in the middle of the audience so we can be efficient. So, and I see a hand up already. You know, Sanjay, you scared me a little bit because when you used the car analogy, when I moved here 6 years ago, I was in an Audi two-door coupe. Now I have an F-150 with 187,000 miles on it. So I'm concerned about my brain health, given your analogy. But
No, you see, that's the whole point is that you can continue to improve your brain at any age. So, if you keep that car running and, you take good care of it, could actually last a long time. Just think of that 90-year-old, guy in Okinawa who flipped me on my back while we're doing karate and did 5-digit math a couple seconds after that. I want to be that guy. That could be your F-150 as well.
I'm not sure how I feel about being compared to a 90-year-old, but okay, so we have a question back here. So mic runners, go ahead and get to the middle. Don't be shy. Get in there so we can be more efficient. We have a question right here.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Doctor, and taking time out of, I'm sure, your busy schedule of joining us today. My name is Natasha Fuller, and I'm a co-founder of a nonprofit that works with individuals who are justice involved and justice impacted. On a personal level, my husband has a traumatic brain injury, and to be honest, it was a neurologist that saved his life. If it wasn't for me being an advocate and a caregiver to make sure to try to find the proper doctor to help him with the injury and the severe mental illnesses that he was diagnosed with, he would not be here. And so my question for you is, what can we do as a community representative to really push the envelope for healthcare plans and other decision makers in our government to really make brain health and neurology as part of that primary care that we should seek after, regardless of diagnosis, medical condition, or what have you, as part of the checkup?
Thank you for that question, and I'm glad your husband's doing better. That's what I do. Take care of a lot of people with traumatic brain injuries. So I know how frightening that is, not just for the person who has endured this, but for the family as well. I think 90% of the attention has been focused on probably 10% of the problem when it comes to brain issues. And again, some of that is understandable. Someone comes in with a brain injury, you need to take care of that brain injury. If they have a blood collection on top of the brain, an epidural hematoma or a subdural, that needs to be relieved so that you can take pressure off the brain or whatever the problem may be. But I think the path leading up to that and the path after that is where we have focused not enough attention. So, and that's 90% of the issue. So how to prevent these sorts of injuries in the first place or problems with the brain in the first place, we're getting better about that, but still probably not where we need to be overall. And then the aftermath. I saw this with my own grandfather. I think, I described this problem where he could write but not read. It's called alexia without agraphia. That's the name of the disorder. And I think, for a period of time, we just assumed that was going to be his life after the stroke. And it wasn't in his case, the vascular surgeons who actually opened up his carotid artery, but it was the rehabilitation doctors who really took care of him and really taught him how to make his brain work again, how to enhance what everyone in this room knows as neuroplasticity, and even to grow new brain cells, which people weren't talking about at that point, but I'm sure their actions made a big difference with regard to neurogenesis as well. So I do think, the idea that there is something that can be done to protect and optimize the brain throughout our lives, regardless of TBI, but also that if someone has a traumatic brain injury, that, okay, you've saved their life. That's great and very, very important. Don't get me wrong. It's part of what attracted me to neurosurgery. But the aftermath of that, like all the various things that can be done to now improve and even optimize their brain function after something like that, is where more attention needs to be focused. And even when it comes to Alzheimer's dementia or dementias in general, we spend a fraction of the money that we spend on other diseases. I think in some ways it almost feels like there's been a throwing in of the towel sometimes when it comes to the optimization of brain health. I think it's starting to change. If you look at NIND's budget coming up, at least the proposed budget for 2025, hopefully some of that will change. But right now, I think there's still that needs to be done at a policy level as well as a individual societal level.
So George has a question over here.
Dr. Gupta, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
My name is George Vredenberg. I'm the chairman of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, which is an effort to link and scale efforts around the world to learn from each other. So what you described about forest bathing was fascinating, because my guess is that meditation is much better understood in other countries of the world than in the developed world. That we have indigenous populations around the world who have an understanding of spirituality in relation to nature that we don't have in the developed world. I'm curious as to whether or not you have seen practices or understood developments beyond forest bathing in other countries, other populations, so that we can learn in the developed world what some of these practices about brain health might be from populations that live closer to nature, that in fact have meditative practices based upon their spiritual traditions.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And the answer is yes. We certainly see societies around the world that live different lives than most of the developed world lives, and seem to have lots of benefits as a result of that when it comes to their brain health. I think what is challenging, George, and I think it's a worthwhile challenge, is to, when you go immerse yourself in one of these other cultures, to then pick out the components of that that seem to make the biggest difference and things that you can then apply to other places around the world. I'll give you a quick example. As part of my my journalism life, I went and lived for a period of time with the Chimane tribe in the rainforest of Bolivia. And the reason that I did that was that there was a group of intrepid researchers who had written an article saying that this Chimane tribe, this indigenous tribe, had the healthiest hearts in the world. It had previously been thought to be elderly Japanese women that had the healthiest hearts in the world, and now they thought it was this indigenous tribe based on all these various metrics. So I decided I wanted to go live with them for a while and just see what it was. Now, right away, you may say, well, of course, an indigenous tribe, they're going to be healthy, just they're indigenous. They have not this sort of connection to the developed world. Actually, not true. Most human populations anywhere on the planet now suffer from the same sorts of medical problems that we see in the developed world. More people die now from overnutrition rather than malnutrition. So, we're seeing that shift. But what was interesting to your question was I just basically decided to observe them and see what their lives were like. And I think it really informed a lot of my thinking, again, like when it came to their movement. Now, first of all, they were living in nature. Okay, so their connection to nature wasn't something that was sporadic. It was their environment. So they were constantly in nature. But when it came to their movement, for example, what I learned from them, maybe a lot of people in this room know, is that hunters typically don't run. They walk a lot, and they track their prey, and then they wait for their prey to get tired, and then they go in with the bow and arrow or a spear or whatever, and that's when they actually get their prey. 17,000 steps per day on average, just to give you a number. The healthiest hearted people in the world walk about 17,000 steps per day. They eat a pretty high carbohydrate diet. I don't think people realize that. They think it's going to be a much more meat-driven diet. But the reality is that if you live in the forest, you have a lot of bad hunting days, a lot of bad fishing days. So you farm your land. And 70% of what they eat is carbohydrates. It is not processed carbohydrates. It's not carbohydrates that has a lot of other stuff thrown into it, but it is carbohydrates. That's a little bit at odds with, I think, how most people think about indigenous tribes. They sleep a lot. If you don't have one of these things to stare at, turns out you sleep a lot. They went to bed, around when the sun went down, 9 o'clock, 9:30. I'd start to hear, heavy breathing all throughout the encampment. And then they woke up around 6:30 with the call to rooster. So about 9 hours a night they were sleeping. But I think one of the biggest things for them was this idea that living in nature was somehow insulating against a lot of the diseases that we suffer from in the developed world. They are the healthiest hearted people in the world. What is interesting is that this year, maybe next year, depending on when they publish the paper, they're also going to find that their rates of dementia are exceedingly low. Again, near reportable, as I mentioned at the top of this talk. So rare that when it does happen, you'd actually report it in one of the journals. So there's a lot of things there. It's the way they move. It's the way they eat. It's the way that they rest. It's the way that they're connected with other people. It's their immersion in nature. They probably have some degree of parasitic infection in their life. Why is that important? Well, for most of our lives as humans, we lived cohabitated, if you will, with parasites. Parasites were actually in our bodies: hookworm, roundworm, giardia. Now, if we have that, we will immediately treat it. In Dallas, you would get treated for a parasitic infection right away, understandably. But our immune systems evolved to have a parasite in our body, which means that now that we don't have it, our immune systems oftentimes get a little bored. And most chronic diseases are either exacerbated by or instigated by our own immune systems. Now, I'm not suggesting you go out and get a parasitic infection. What I'm saying is that living in nature, being at one with nature, cohabitating with nature, it means a lot of different things. It's complicated, and it should be complicated. So yes, there's a lot of things we can learn from places around the world, George. But I think, there is some virtue in really studying these things, understanding the mechanisms of these things, replicating these things, and then hopefully applying them to other humans on the planet.
So, Nancy, we'll have you ask our final question, and then we'll wrap up.
It's kind of a statement as well as just a question. I'm an advisory board member. I'm not a scientist, but when you live in a city like Dallas without these beautiful trees, all of us surrounded, depending on where we live, I recommend a couple of books. One is called Mindful Gardening. It's a strange little title, but it says exactly what you're saying, what we can get from just thinking about what we're doing when we're dealing with plants. The other was written by a scientist who is also an indigenous Indian, Dr. Zimmermer, and every chapter is taking us back to the earth of how her grandparents and great-grandparents taught them the stories of how we need the earth, we need the plants, we need the air, we need everything it provides to make our lives better. So we have to make our own little spaces like that, I think, when we live in a very busy city. So that's helped me anyway. Thank you for mentioning all that about the forest.
It's a great statement. We have 2 minutes left, and I have two questions, but one I just have been dying to ask this whole time, which is, what is it like to cut into a human brain?
I've been doing this a long time, Sarah, as you know, and I still find it incredibly exciting, and in a way, as much as I said we want to demystify the brain, we want to be able to understand it better, it is still very mystifying to me. The brain itself, feels like a piece of, like, it's soft, it always surprised me once you get through the skull that it's just sitting right there, the brain. I always thought it would put up more of a fight, at that point. But it's just there, and it's amazing when you're actually operating on it, that it's I don't know, it's hard to describe even after 30 years, I think, of what it's like. But I don't think it ever becomes procedural. It doesn't ever feel like just a practice. It always feels like something really, really heady. And I think a lot about the patients. I think a lot about their families. There was this book that was written years ago called When Air Hits the Brain. I think it was by a couple of neurosurgeons that lived in Pittsburgh at the time. And it made the case that whenever you do have to open the brain, just by virtue of the fact that the air is now hitting the brain, it changes in some way, which I found really, really interesting. So, you do everything you can not to have to operate on the brain, but it's still an incredibly heady experience, I think, every time.
Well, I love that last thing that you said. It changes the brain, and that's what we're here talking about, is the ability to change the brain. So if you have one last piece of advice to give to us, how would you recommend that everybody personally change their brain today?
I'll tell you a funny thing. So when I wrote this book, of course, I called my mom and I said, "Mom, I've written this book." And my mom, who's classic engineer sort of mentality, she goes, "Give me the headline." That's it. I said, "Well, you should read the book. Well, just give me the headline, So I said to my mom, I said, here's something I would suggest you do every day for your brain. Go for a brisk walk with a close friend and talk about your problems." That's what I told her. It incorporated for me many things: brisk walking for all the reasons we talked about earlier, the connectedness of actually calling up a friend and doing that quality connection, but then the hack of creating the profundity of the relationship by talking about your problems, by allowing yourself to be vulnerable. So besides eating right and obviously getting enough sleep and relieving your stress the way that we talked about, I recommend doing things that are a little non-conventional, like maybe if you're right-handed, eating your dinner with your left hand tonight to just activate these other parts of your brain. But I think more importantly than anything, go for a brisk walk with a close friend and talk about your problems.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you.